What if I told you that the most complete Bible on earth was deliberately hidden from the world for over 1,600 years? Not because it was false, not because it was dangerous to faith, but because it told a truth so powerful it could shatter the foundations of religious control. The Ethiopian Bible, 81 books of sacred scripture, 27 books longer than your King James Bible, 15 books more than the Catholic version, and buried within its ancient pages, stories that would change everything you thought you knew about God's plan for humanity. Picture this scene. The year is 330 AD. A young Syrian named Frumentius stands before King Ezana of Aksum, trembling. Not from fear, from anticipation. The king has just declared Ethiopia a Christian nation, one of the first in human history. But here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school. Ethiopia didn't just accept Christianity. They preserved it in a form that would soon be edited everywhere else. While Roman emperors were deciding which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopian scribes were copying texts in the ancient language of Ge'ez, books that contained secrets, mysteries, revelations about angels, fallen beings, and the true origins of evil. But why would an African kingdom become the guardian of these forbidden texts? The answer lies in a story that began centuries before Christ was born. Long before European missionaries set foot on African soil, Ethiopia was already a spiritual powerhouse. Queen Sheba herself walked from this land to meet King Solomon. The Ethiopian eunuch was baptized by Philip in the book of Acts. Moses married an Ethiopian woman. But here's where it gets revolutionary. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's national epic, the Ark of the Covenant itself was brought from Jerusalem to Aksum, not stolen, transferred by divine command. Imagine the scene. Menelik I, son of Solomon and Sheba, standing in the Holy of Holies, the presence of God surrounding him. And in that moment, God choosing Africa as the new guardian of his covenant. The scribes who recorded this weren't writing fiction. They were documenting their spiritual DNA, their unbroken connection to the throne room of heaven. And when Christianity arrived through Frumentius, it wasn't replacing their faith, it was fulfilling it. Now here's where the story takes a dark turn. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was systematically deciding which books would survive and which would disappear forever. The councils of Hippo and Carthage, political gatherings disguised as spiritual meetings, men in robes determining what billions of souls would be allowed to read. One by one, they eliminated the texts that revealed too much. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees erased, the Shepherd of Hermas silenced. But in the highland monasteries of Ethiopia, these books lived on. The monks didn't just preserve them, they cherished them, copied them, illuminated them with gold and crimson ink. Why? Because these books contained knowledge that transformed how you understood everything. Let me tell you about Enoch. Not the 2 verses in Genesis that briefly mention him, the entire book. 308 chapters of cosmic revelation that the Western Church desperately wanted buried. Enoch didn't just walk with God. He was taken on a guided tour of heaven itself. He saw the throne room, the crystal sea, the 24 elders. But more than that, he witnessed the trial of the fallen angels. Picture Enoch overwhelmed as the Watchers, these magnificent beings who once served in God's presence, are brought before the Almighty in chains. Their crime? Teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, corrupting the bloodline, creating the Nephilim giants that terrorized the earth. In vivid detail, Enoch describes their punishment, their eternal imprisonment, the flood that would cleanse the earth of their offspring. But here's what made the Western Church uncomfortable. Enoch's visions revealed that spiritual warfare wasn't metaphorical. It was literal, ongoing, and humanity was caught in the crossfire. These weren't allegories, these were intelligence reports from heaven itself. The Book of Jubilees went even further. While Genesis gives you the highlights of creation, Jubilees provides the detailed timeline, not in years, in Jubilee cycles of 49 years each. It names Adam's wife, Awan. It explains how Noah divided the earth among his sons. It reveals which bloodlines carried God's covenant and which carried his judgment. But most controversially, it established a solar calendar of 364 days that completely contradicted the lunar calendar Rome preferred. Imagine the implications. If Jubilees was correct, then the church had been celebrating Easter on the wrong days, observing feasts at the wrong times, following a calendar that God never ordained. Ethiopian Christians still follow this ancient calendar today. Their Christmas falls on January 7th by our reckoning. Their new year begins in September. They're not being different for the sake of tradition. They're following the original instructions, preserved in texts the Western world lost. But how do we know these Ethiopian texts are authentic? Let me paint you a picture of discovery that reads like an adventure novel. The year is 1773. Scottish explorer James Bruce is trekking through the Ethiopian highlands, searching for the source of the Blue Nile. But what he finds is far more precious than geographical knowledge. In the ancient monasteries, he discovers 3 complete manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, written in Ge'ez, perfectly preserved despite being over 1,000 years old. Bruce's hands tremble as he realizes what he's holding. The Western world hasn't seen a complete Enoch manuscript since the 4th century. Scholars had begun to doubt it ever existed. But here it is, safe in African hands, waiting for the world to be ready. When Bruce publishes the first English translation in 1821, it sends shockwaves through biblical scholarship. Suddenly, mysterious references in the New Testament make sense. Jude's quotation of Enoch's prophecy, Peter's mention of angels in chains, the origins of apocalyptic literature. Ethiopia hadn't just preserved a book, they had safeguarded the missing pieces of biblical understanding. But the Ethiopian manuscripts go deeper than medieval copies. Deep in the highlands, at the monastery of Abba Garima, lie 2 gospel books that will make your spine tingle. Carbon dating places them between 330 and 650 AD. That makes them potentially the oldest surviving complete gospel manuscripts in the world. Older than the famous Codex Sinaiticus in Britain, older than the Codex Vaticanus in Rome. The illustrations alone are breathtaking. Angels with dark skin and flowing robes. Christ depicted not as a European prince, but as a Middle Eastern king who could have walked the streets of ancient Jerusalem. But here's what gives you chills. According to tradition, these Gospels were written by Abba Garima himself, a monk from Constantinople who arrived in Ethiopia in 494 AD. Legend says God made the sun stand still, so Garima could complete copying the entire New Testament in a single day. Whether you believe the miracle or not, the manuscripts exist, perfectly preserved, a testament to Ethiopian Christianity's ancient roots. Now let's talk about why the Ethiopian church was really isolated from Rome and Constantinople. It wasn't just geography, it was theology. In 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon declared that Christ has 2 natures, divine and human, in one person. Most of the Christian world accepted this formula. Ethiopia said no. Not because they denied Christ's divinity or humanity, but because they believed something more profound. Something called tewahedo, meaning being made one. To the Ethiopian church, Christ doesn't have 2 natures existing side by side. He has one unified nature, perfectly combining divine and human into something transcendent. It's a subtle difference that had massive implications. Rome and Constantinople wanted clean categories. Ethiopian theology embraced mystery. They refused to reduce the incarnation to a philosophical formula, and that theological independence gave them the freedom to preserve texts that didn't fit Western systematic theology. Remember those fallen angel stories that made the Western church so uncomfortable? In Ethiopian tradition, they weren't embarrassing myths to be explained away. They were essential intelligence about the spiritual realm. The Book of Enoch doesn't just mention fallen angels in passing. It names them, describes their specialties, reveals how they corrupted human civilization. Azazel taught warfare and metallurgy. Semjaza led the rebellion that produced the Nephilim. Barakil taught astrology. Kokobel revealed the constellations. To Ethiopian Christians, this wasn't fantasy literature. This was understanding your enemy. They practiced exorcism not as a rare emergency procedure, but as regular spiritual maintenance. They fasted not just during Lent, but over 200 days per year. They viewed the spiritual battle as constant, intense, and requiring serious preparation. Meanwhile, Western Christianity was becoming increasingly rationalized, demythologized, stripped of its mystical elements. Which tradition do you think preserved more of the original apostolic faith? But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Ethiopian Christianity is how Jewish it remained. Walk into an Ethiopian Orthodox church today. You'll witness practices that would make a first-century Christian feel at home. The priests perform animal sacrifices on certain feast days. Worshippers remove their shoes before entering the sanctuary. The church is divided into 3 sections. Like the temple in Jerusalem, every Ethiopian church contains a replica of the Ark of the Covenant called a Tabat. It's kept in the Holy of Holies and only brought out for special processions. Ethiopian Christians observe the Sabbath on Saturday and Sunday. They practice circumcision alongside baptism. They follow Old Testament dietary laws, refusing pork and shellfish. Why did they maintain these practices when the rest of Christianity abandoned them? Because they had the Book of Jubilees. And Jubilees made clear that God's laws weren't temporary suggestions. They were eternal principles that Christ came to fulfill, not eliminate. This wasn't Judaizing Christianity. This was preserving Christianity's Jewish foundation, while other churches were Hellenizing it beyond recognition. And this brings us to one of history's most fascinating religious communities, the Beta Israel. Ethiopian Jews who claimed descent from the tribe of Dan, who practiced Judaism using the same Ge'ez language as Ethiopian Christians, who possessed ancient traditions that connected them directly to Solomon's temple. For over a millennium, these two communities, Jewish and Christian Ethiopians, lived side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation, but always sharing a common conviction that Ethiopia was chosen by God as a repository of sacred truth. The Beta Israel preserved oral traditions about the Ark of the Covenant, about the journey of Menelik from Jerusalem to Aksum, about the true pronunciation of God's sacred name. Ethiopian Christians preserved the written texts, the expanded biblical canon, the mystical commentaries. Together, they maintained a version of biblical faith that was simultaneously more ancient and more complete than anything surviving in Europe or the Middle East. But by the 16th century, everything began to change. Portuguese missionaries arrived in Ethiopia, horrified by what they found. Christianity that looked nothing like Roman Catholicism, practices that seemed more Jewish than Christian, books that weren't in their Bible. The Portuguese brought more than the gospel. They brought guns, political pressure, economic leverage. For almost a century, they tried to force Ethiopian Christianity into a European mold. They banned the Ge'ez liturgy, condemned the Ethiopian calendar, declared the Book of Enoch heretical. Emperor Susenyos even temporarily converted to Catholicism in 1622, triggering a civil war that nearly destroyed the country. But here's what the Portuguese didn't understand. They weren't dealing with ignorant natives who needed enlightenment. They were confronting a Christian tradition that predated their own by centuries. A biblical canon that had remained stable while Europe was still pagan. The Ethiopians weren't missing the truth. They were preserving it. And that's when the global suppression really began. As European colonial powers spread across Africa, they carried a very specific version of Christianity, one that portrayed Africans as spiritually inferior, historically insignificant, culturally primitive. The Ethiopian Bible contradicted every aspect of this narrative. Here was an African nation that had preserved the oldest biblical manuscripts, maintained the most complete scriptural canon, practiced the most ancient forms of Christian worship. Here was proof that Africa wasn't the dark continent waiting for European enlightenment. It was the guardian of lights that Europe had extinguished. So the Ethiopian Bible was marginalized, dismissed as pseudepigraphic, ignored by biblical scholars, excluded from theological seminaries, not because it lacked authenticity, but because it revealed too much authenticity in the wrong hands. But manuscripts have a way of surviving, even when institutions try to destroy them. During the Italian invasion of 1935, Mussolini's forces specifically targeted Ethiopian monasteries. They understood that destroying the books would break the people's spirit more effectively than military conquest. Yet monastery after monastery reported the same miraculous story. The ancient manuscripts survived, hidden in caves, buried in secret locations, carried by monks who fled to the mountains. The Garima Gospels endured an actual fire in the 1930s, emerging unscathed. Local believers called it a miracle, skeptics called it impossible. But the books remained, waiting for a generation that would recognize their value. Fast forward to 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered at Qumran. Suddenly, biblical scholars are finding Hebrew and Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, texts that match exactly with the Ethiopian manuscripts that scholars had dismissed for centuries. The Ethiopian Church hadn't preserved corrupted copies. They had maintained the original traditions in their purest form. Fragment after fragment confirmed what Ethiopian Christians had always known. Their biblical canon wasn't an expansion of the real Bible. It was a preservation of the complete Bible. The Western Church hadn't possessed the authentic scriptures. They had possessed an edited version. But even as archaeological evidence mounted, institutional Christianity resisted change. Seminary professors continued teaching the 66-book canon as if it were divinely ordained. Publishers kept printing study Bibles that ignored the Ethiopian texts. Christian bookstores refused to stock translations of Enoch or Jubilees. Why? Because accepting the Ethiopian Bible meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths. That biblical authority wasn't determined by European councils. That African Christians had preserved truths that European Christians had lost. That the primitive church of Ethiopia was actually more sophisticated than the advanced churches of the West. Most challenging of all, that spiritual truth had been entrusted to black hands when white institutions were busy playing politics. And this brings us to the heart of why the Ethiopian Bible was truly banned. Not officially, never formally, but systematically marginalized until most Christians didn't even know it existed. Because the Ethiopian Bible doesn't just preserve additional books, it preserves a different understanding of God's relationship with humanity. In Western theology, salvation is often individual, personal, focused on getting souls to heaven. In Ethiopian theology, shaped by Enoch's cosmic visions and Jubilee's historical sweep, salvation is cosmic, communal, focused on God's justice breaking into history. The fallen angels aren't just ancient history, they're ongoing oppressors whose systems must be resisted. The Nephilim aren't just mythological giants, they're structures of evil that crush the poor and marginalized. Reading Enoch in a slave plantation or a colonized territory, you don't see ancient mythology, you see current events. You understand that your suffering isn't random, it's part of a spiritual war that God will ultimately win. That's why the Ethiopian Bible was dangerous, not because it threatened faith, but because it empowered the faithful. Today, something unprecedented is happening. African Christians are rediscovering their theological heritage. Ethiopian monasteries are digitizing their manuscripts. Scholars worldwide are finally taking the Gez tradition seriously, and the implications are staggering. Imagine Christianity that never lost its mystical edge, that maintained direct connection to its Jewish roots, that preserved the cosmic scope of biblical revelation. Imagine a church that saw spiritual warfare as real, that practiced fasting as power, that understood suffering as participation in cosmic justice. That's not imagination. That's Ethiopian Christianity, preserved through 1700 years of isolation, persecution, and marginalization. The Garima Gospels still rest in their highland monastery. Visitors describe an overwhelming sense of presence, as if the accumulated prayers of 70 generations still linger in the ancient air. The Book of Enoch still opens with the same words that captivated readers 2 millennia ago, the words of the blessing of Enoch, wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation. The Book of Jubilees still counts the cycles of history, approaching completion, warning of final judgment, promising ultimate restoration. These aren't museum pieces. They're living documents, speaking to a generation that faces the same spiritual battles Enoch witnessed in heaven. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. The Ethiopian Bible isn't just African history, it's global destiny. Every tradition that was suppressed is resurfacing. Every text that was marginalized is being studied. Every theological insight that was dismissed is being rediscovered. The Protestant Reformation recovered the doctrine of salvation by faith. The Catholic Counter-Reformation recovered the importance of tradition. The Eastern Orthodox preserved the mystical theology. But the Ethiopian Reformation happening right now is recovering the cosmic scope of biblical faith. The understanding that God's story includes the whole universe. Angels and demons, giants and nations, calendars and covenants, all preserved in African hands, all waiting for the world to be ready. So let me ask you the question that changes everything. What if the Bible you've been reading is missing chapters? What if the Christianity you've been taught is only part of the story? What if there's a version of faith that's simultaneously more ancient and more radical than anything you've encountered? The Ethiopian Bible doesn't replace your current understanding. It completes it. It doesn't contradict the gospel you know. It reveals the cosmic context you've been missing. It doesn't minimize Christ's work. It magnifies the scope of his victory over powers and principalities that Western theology barely acknowledges. Right now, in monasteries scattered across the Ethiopian highlands, monks are still copying these ancient texts by hand, still preserving knowledge that empires tried to destroy. They're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for a generation that's hungry for the whole truth. For believers who know there has to be more than what they've been given. The manuscripts are calling, not just to African Christians reconnecting with their heritage, but to every believer who senses that conventional Christianity has left out something essential. The Book of Enoch is calling to those who know spiritual warfare is real, but lack the vocabulary to understand it. The Book of Jubilees is calling to those who want to connect biblical history with cosmic justice. The Ethiopian tradition is calling to those who refuse to choose between mystical experience and historical grounding. The choice isn't whether these books belong in your Bible. Different traditions will make different decisions about canonicity. The choice is whether you'll investigate what was preserved or remain content with what was lost. Whether you'll explore the theological treasure that survived in Africa or accept that European editing was somehow divinely guided. Whether you'll allow your understanding of God's plan to expand or insist that truth must fit within familiar boundaries. The Ethiopian Bible exists. The manuscripts are real. The theological insights are profound. What you do with that reality will determine how complete your faith becomes. In a world hungry for authentic spirituality, Ethiopia has been guarding the recipe for 1700 years. The question isn't whether they preserved the truth. The question is whether you're ready to receive it.